Actually, we are still waiting for one external member. Is he going to be online? Yes. Yeah? Okay, can we get him? I don't know who can help us to get Professor Branimir Jovancicevic online. Here he is.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, then let us start. My name is László Brust. I'm the co-director of the Democracy Institute of the Central European University. We'd like to welcome you and this very interesting panel that deals with this question of is deep polarization in society a driver of autocratization. Since we have an excellent group of panelists, politicians and eggheads or political scientists, we are really well versed to discuss this question. Let me introduce first the panelists and then ask a few questions. We have Andreas Schädler, who is the lead researcher of the DEN Redemocratization working group of the Democracy Institute. Filip Milacic, a senior researcher at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Katalin Cseh, member of the European Parliament and vice president of Renew Europe. Then Johanna Lutz, who is the head of the Vienna office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And Branimir Jovancicevic, I hope you will excuse me for my Serbian pronunciation. We can't hear you. If you unmute yourself, it will be better. Branimir, we can't hear you.
Okay, now you hear me, yes?
Yeah. Now that's getting closer to something that you would like to say.
In the Budapest, but I think that will be successful on this way too. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So we deal with this question of deep polarization and so the link between polarization and autocratization. And one of the occasions of this panel, it's not just that there is a deep polarization that plays a very important role in what's going on in many of the countries of the globe, not just in Hungary, but in many other countries. But we have just out a new publication from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung of a research on identity, partisanship, and polarization with the title How Democratically Elected Politicians Get Away with Autocratizing Their Country. It's a very interesting piece co-authored by two of the participants of this panel, Johanna Lutz and Filip Milacic, but also among the authors we have Elena Avramovska and Milan Zvolik, whose piece on polarization appeared 2 years ago in the American Political Science Review, and that was actually a very influential piece on polarization. Now, the question is about the link between polarization and autocratization. So let's start with the scholarship on this issue. We are assumed, and actually when I studied political sociology, we actually had to read a piece from Klaus Offe, in which Offe says that democratic elections are a civilized form of civil war. That is, so to say, polarization is sort of part of the normal functioning of democracy. At least time to time, every fourth year, there is an extreme version of polarization in interests and values, and after that, the elections in a way settle this conflict for the next 4 years, don't solve this problem, of course, but they create a settlement in which someone gets the opportunity to govern based on the values and interests, and others have to be in opposition and wait for the next round of elections. So polarization is part of normal functioning of democracy. Now, of course, we have polarization in the recent literature more with adjectives like deep polarization or pernicious polarization. So there must be something in this polarization that might be not so kosher, something that is not so good. So my first question is to Andreas. What is polarization? And how would you just discuss, how would you start discussing this issue of what's the link between polarization and autocratization?
Thank you, Laszlo. Should I speak from here?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. All right. I would say I would not answer directly. I would like to not answer your question directly, but that's kind of where I would like to go to. The overall question of the panel, as we know, is whether depolarization affects or
Sorry,
drives
I can't hear something
autocratization.
Wrong.
And the common sense in the literature would be a clear and resounding yes. If you read the comparative literature on autocratization, on the global crisis of democracy, on democratic backsliding, whatever the precise label, it is almost invariably associated with polarization. So that's really that's a kind of common sense, and I think it's good to whenever we see that kind of common sense is to say, okay, how clear is it really? Do we know what we are talking about? How firm does it hold? And what exactly is it we are referring to? So it's really it's a huge concern in public debate, and precisely because of that association, because of that intuitive association. And it's a huge topic in comparative political science. I did a tiny research, and more than half of all the papers, all the articles published on the topic in political science have appeared over the past 7 years. So it's really, together with the debate on autocratization, we have that on polarization. And if you look at the literature, it contains long lists of democratic damages polarization is supposed to cause. I have the references if you wish, but here's just the list of damages to democracy attributed to polarization. The first thing is always prevalence of confrontation over cooperation, moderation, and compromise, which are supposed to be the basis of liberal democracy. A host of performance failures due to radical policy swings, the entrenchment of policy positions, policy statements, and problems of coalition formation. Then we have a long list of democratic attitudes which are supposed to erode in context of polarization. Trust in government, trust in public institutions, trust among citizens, democratic satisfaction, democratic support, the legitimacy of elections, democratic legitimacy overall. All these things are supposed to suffer under polarization. And then it's not just what is the core of the Friedrich Ebert's study, the tolerance for anti-democratic behavior, and even the support for anti-democratic behavior, but anti-democratic behavior itself. So we are supposed to see the surge of contentious politics, democratic transgressions, political violence, and even the destruction of democracy in the wake of polarization. There's one nice quotation by Giovanni Sartori, who is kind of the outstanding figure in earlier debates on polarization. And back in the 80s, he wrote, the best single explanatory variable for stable versus unstable, functioning versus non-functioning, successful versus immobile, and easy versus difficult democracy is polarization. And today we have kind of a similar consensus, kind of that idea against what you said, Laszlo, initially, against kind of Klaus Offe's notion that this is something normal, we now have really something like probably even a moral panic, but really deep concerns associated with polarization. So when we have all these causal intuitions, I think we really get back to your question, Laszlo. Okay, if polarization is supposed to generate all these damaging consequences, what kind of beast is it? What are we talking about? How comes that an abstract bundle of dynamics may wreak such havoc on democracy? Yeah? And if you look at U.S. political science and the study of U.S. American democracy, and the kind of the slow emergence of studies of polarization over the past decades, even before current debates on democratic backsliding, there precisely we see a very similar intuition to Klaus Offe's. Basically, in the U.S., colleagues have been startled by observing the transformation of a two-party system where parties were really quite indistinct of each other, overlapping ideologically, hard to differentiate. Kind of a muddled situation we Europeans always thought was kind of pathological. And now they have seen a disentanglement of their parties who have gotten more and more programmatically distinct, which means ideologically coherent internally and ideologically distinct among each other. And so US political scientists would talk about this process of programmatic differentiation as polarization. And because they do so, they basically describe something which is basic to democratic competition, meaningful programmatic differences between parties, between competitors, between candidates. They describe it as polarization, and they think, well, up to a certain degree, it's good for democracy. It's normal in democracy, and everybody would agree. And I think this is also kind of the background why we are asked to think about the effects of deep polarization. Laszlo, you mentioned polarization with adjectives. Yes, we have that. We have kind of people distinguishing between kind of this normal programmatic differences, which I think we shouldn't really describe as polarization, but they put kind of adjectives like thin and weak and beneficial polarization to it, and all the rest is extreme and pernicious and harsh or deep polarization. So it's not quite clear what it is, but it's clearly a realm of political conflict that exceeds what we normally expect in a democracy. So we would all agree democracy is not a system for kind of to uphold harmony or to manage harmony, but to process conflict. And polarization seems to be, or at least deep polarization, seems to describe a situation where conflicts go out of hand, where they are excessive according to our democratic standards. I think when we start thinking about, well, which kinds of conflicts might be excessive for democracy, this is really a very muddled field. And I think in the political science debate and polarization, we have not been sufficiently precise about that. And there are basically three dimensions in the literature. One which is kind of the classic, the substantive dimension, that polarization is about policy conflict over material interests, ideas, social values, left, right, conservative, progressive, etc. Then the second thing would be a moral dimension, where polarization would describe a situation where people divide the world into good versus bad people. So we are the decent ones, and the other are evil actors who mean who are ill-faithed and mean harm to the polity. And then there is something I think we have been overlooking, and which is a third dimension I'm trying to introduce, which is, or emphasize, a democratic dimension, which basically consists of mutual perceptions of adversaries as enemies of democracy. And here I really think here we have a clear connection to democratic damages of polarization. If polarization is a situation where political actors come to perceive the other side as a threat to democracy, then it's much clearer to see how that is damaging to democracy. In the other dimensions, we may very well go with Klaus Orfe and say, that's the way democracy works. It's supposed to be about, yes, harsh conflicts, perhaps not civil war. That's a metaphor. I wouldn't talk about that. But it is about real high stakes, passionate, meaningful conflict, and it often does involve the idea that, okay, the other guys, they are really self-serving, amoral, uncaring for the common good, for our conceptions of the common good at least. So substantive and moral conflicts we might consider as normal in democracy, but kind of the idea that we are playing by the rules and the others don't, the others are a threat to our democratic coexistence because they violate the basics of democracy, I think this is really threatening. And if you think about kind of what happens with democracy in a situation where where adversaries we view each others as enemies of democracy, basically. So this mutual charges. So the main implications, and just a short list, it cancels any possibility of constituting a united front of Democrats against anti-democrats, because there are two fronts of Democrats against anti-democrats, at least on a subjective level. Then both sides in this conflict will be tempted to, well, defend democracy in ways that may be undermining democracy. And whatever they do in the defense of democratic values, the other side is bound to perceive it as, well, just another attack on democracy. Just look at the US. The US, I think, is the perfect illustration of these things right now. And so violations of democratic norms by one side end up violations of democratic norms by the other. And perceived norm transgressions, kind of the hallmark of polarization, end up driving actual norm transgressions, autocratization. So in a nutshell, and I'm concluding, what polarization does in this crucial democratic dimension of mutual perceptions of democratic threats, it upsets democracy as a system of reciprocal norm compliance. In democracy, we don't ask anybody just to be a good guy and comply with democratic norms, regardless of what others do. We comply with democratic norms under the expectations that others do so as well. And when this expectation goes through the roof, almost everything else goes through the roof as well. So it really unravels the system of reciprocal cooperation that forms the very heart of democracy. Thank you.
Actually, that also leads to the second question to Johanna and Philip, that this expectation has to be stable, that everyone plays by these rules, and transgression of democratic norms will be punished by the voters, that the electorate will not reward, actually, but will punish those who limit the political freedoms of others or tilt the playing field towards themselves arbitrarily. So, surprisingly, this is not the finding of Johanna and Philip. So I would like to, you in whichever order, to start to elaborate on this issue, that as your title implies, that there are factors that actually are between this civilized form of civil war and so that would, so to say, tame the conflict to stay within the realm of democratic norms.
Yeah, thank you. About punishing and punishing behavior, that's basically that was the outset of our research that we did, that we applied to European countries, 7 European countries. And because, Andreas, as you said, it's polarization and how polarization threatens democracy. It's being debated everywhere. And we really wanted to see what influence does it really have, and what are the mechanisms, how does polarization really work. And the well, basically option that voters have is to punish someone at the ballot box if someone, like a politician, behaves undemocratically. And we basically copied a research and, together with Milan Svolik from Yale University that he had done in the US a couple of years ago, and applied this to Germany, Poland, Estonia, Spain, Serbia, and Ukraine, and wanted to see whether the same the mechanism works in the same way as it does apparently in the US, where then he established that polarization really is a driver for the threat to democracy or for autocratization. And what we found, and we did an experimental setup, we didn't just ask people directly, but we really basically created a scenario where all the survey participants had to do candidate choices, and therefore we could see how would voters really act if they are exposed to a situation where they have to decide between somebody who holds or proposes an undemocratic measure, but also at the same time has stands for certain policy positions that that are in their interest, or who belongs to a party that they support. And what we found, they would win this election by a really big margin. So whereas when we found that the average punishment, that means like a candidate would lose on average in Europe minus 7.8%. But then whenever there was the favorite party candidate, they would gain another like 20 up to almost 30%. So this was overruling. And we were really surprised by this, because we also heard like people don't really trust parties, but apparently they do trust their preferred party for some reason. And we also saw that some policy people also traded democracy off for their policy interests. And we also found that these were mostly, we had different policy issues that we tested, and we found that it's mostly identity-related policies that voters were ready to give up democracy for, and socioeconomic policy issues did not really play such a big role. And we also found that we really tested. We didn't just generalize polarization, as it's often done in some of these indices, which of course makes sense. We say, okay, this society is very polarized and the other one is perhaps less polarized or so. But we really measured how polarized people were over all these policy issues from these different areas that we tested. And there we found that people in these 7 European countries are polarized over different issues. So in Eastern Europe, for example, in our 5 Eastern European countries, we saw that they are heavily polarized, or the most polarizing issue was the rights for same-sex couples. Whereas in the Western European countries, it was different. It was immigration in Sweden, environmental policy in Germany, and the use of minority language in Spain. And so we see that actually the polarization could lie in a different policy field in these countries. And then we also see, when we tested how much are people willing to punish undemocratic behavior, or how much are they willing to forgive if it comes to a polarizing issue. we found very different, like really a mixed result. It wasn't like in Swalik's US study where we saw that whenever they are polarized, they really forgive undemocratic behavior. But we found that for for same-sex couples' rights, they were almost always ready to give up to tolerate undemocratic behavior, and so sometimes we found that polarizing and the polarizing issue or polarization over a certain issue and forgiving undemocratic behavior comes together. But we also had cases where this wasn't the case. For example, in Spain is not polarized over same-sex couples' rights, but they still would tolerate undemocratic behavior for this. And we also saw these. For different issues in different countries, and we even saw that there is polarization on an issue that is Poland, where they are heavily polarized around environmental policy, but they would not tolerate undemocratic behavior for this. So that's actually exactly the contrary example. There is polarization, but no, the Polish would still punish an undemocratic behavior nevertheless. So with this a bit more, let's say, finer examination of the mechanism of how polarization could work, we came to a very diverse finding, and we could say there are perhaps also other factors at play, not just polarization.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Philip.
If I may just add, well, Andreas mentioned that various aspects that are mentioned also in the literature about how concretely polarization threatens democracy. And then Johanna said that basically we measured polarization in our study. We didn't only base our findings on this. There is German expression Bauchgefühl, that would be like a stomach feeling. So on anecdotic evidence, we actually measured, we investigated policy polarization, measured, and we saw that some interests are polarizing, and for those interests, voters would sacrifice democracy, but there are also interests that are not polarizing, but voters will still sacrifice democracy for them. So basically, we see here this mechanism that citizens, they stop becoming citizens and they start acting as fans. And as fans, they want that their team wins, and then it's no matter what costs are. And this is what is regarded as the biggest threat for democracy. However, according to our data, we see that citizens, they're also becoming fans for interests that are not polarized. So, and this is the key puzzle, basically, that we identified in our findings. So we think that this, based on these findings, we think that the theory on polarization need to be refined. So, and that some other factors are here at play regarding the decisions of voters to forgive undemocratic behavior. We also offered some potential explanations. So one of them would be to focus on group interests, group identities, group loyalties, so that people also, they cling to those interests even though the interests are not polarizing. And also what we also offered is the role of the political actors. So, and to be more precise, the role of political entrepreneurs, who by weaponizing and politicizing these issues are not only deepening polarization, but making them salient, so that many voters would still sacrifice democracy for them. And since we have two political actors here on the panel, I'm really eager to hear your opinion on the role of political actors in these processes.
Thanks a lot. Actually, you just prepared my question to them, because we researchers of polarization or democratization or redemocratization, we study probabilities, and they are the masters of possibilities. So my question to Katalin and then to Branimir, two politicians, active politicians in this panel, question is first, what are for you signs of deep or pernicious polarization, and how do you think politicians can fight against them? Katalin, you might start.
Yes, thank you. And it's always fascinating to speak after these scholars, because I always learn so much from you. Let me try to provide for the audience a bit more practical examples of what was already mentioned before. And let me just start with how polarization appears in society and in political life. And let me just come with a very, very concrete case that I actually experienced recently in the election campaign. One of many. So imagine a small town in Hungary. It's in the northeast part. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods of this country. And I'm speaking to an old lady who comes to our booth that is set up in the market hall. So she starts complaining that she couldn't afford to live from her pension, that the air quality is so bad there is corruption everywhere, and she sees like all the things that are like going on in the country, and she is not happy. All her grandchildren are living in somewhere in the West. She doesn't even see them, I don't know, once in 5 years. So she has a lot of problems, a lot of complaints. And so I asked her, so do you plan to turn up at the election and vote? She was like, of course, I'm coming to vote. I'm voting for Fidesz, the governing party. And I'm like, okay, but you just like listed all the reasons that you have problems with. Oh yes, but I am very afraid that if Mr. Orban loses, then the migrants would come and the European Union would force LGBTQ transsexual surgery on the kids in the kindergarten. And she totally said that. And she was nice. She understood me. She came to me. She had all these problems. She had a very good picture, I think, about the problems in her community. But she just like cared about the these made-up threats that were used to polarize her group against an imaginary enemy. So this is just, I think, a very, very practical symptom of what is wrong in society. And let me just come in with another point. So the entire discussion beforehand was about whether voters are mindful enough of democratic challenges in order to rank them above polarization and also some anti-democratic means. And I think the big question here is whether voters do even care about democracy that much anymore, because I'm not sure that's the case. I saw very, very varying studies that polled all across Europe. It was basically some choice between two options, something on the line that whether you would prefer a well-functioning democratic state or a more effective one-man rule. So it was something on that scale. And for instance, in the case of Hungary, but not only that, quite a strong majority of people prefer the one-man rule. So democracy wasn't that much of an attractive option anymore. And if we are just like starting off from this context, it's easier and easier for those who try to use polarization for their own political gains to surpass democracy as something that, is like very theoretical, it's in the past, this is not only the only option. So if we are on this trajectory, then I think there really has to be a lot of political work done to change that and to really point out to people that why does democracy matter for them. And this is where I think we really have a lot to do, because all these concepts can seem so abstract, so big, so far away. And what polarizing actors use in the day-to-day political discourse is to really try to pitch people against each other, try to deepen these divisions within society, try to blow up imaginary threats so that voters do not recognize the real threats that are actually preying on their everyday life. And as we are heading into just another economic crisis, I am very much afraid that these tendencies will be even stronger and stronger. So what politicians can do, I think it's first is engagement and dialogue. Try not to get into this game, because it's very, very easy. And I have to say that also the Hungarian opposition is a bit guilty here, because if there is this polarizing blame game going on, it's kind of easy to take the side that, like, yes, but you are destroying democracy. And as was heard before, that is like one of the problems that you also listed. Of course, the real question is like, what do you say if you're a politician and your opponent is actually destroying democracy? So, but indeed, we should be probably using more compromise language. We should move towards the middle. We should try to make better reasons and also grassroots community building to try to make these people connect with each other. But this is not easy, and social media and also the lack of regulation in many, many walks of life, regulations in regards to electoral campaigns, political advertising, intransparent media rules really facilitates the media environment that has been fueling this polarization. So just to close here, what I think politicians should do, apart from changing our language maybe, is also to make better laws. And this is what we have to do also in the European Union to, for instance, create a new European Media Act, which would enable us to prevent further divisions that are artificially ingrained in society by malicious actors from the outside, but also from the inside. But it's a hard work, and we are very much neck deep in this problem, so we need to climb out of here somehow. Thank you.
Thank you. Branimir.
Yes, first of all...
some louder a little.
Do you hear me? You hear me, yes? Do you hear me now?
Just a little better.
Okay, but I hear you very good.
Okay, yeah, that's good, fine.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. This panel discussion, it's really great. It's a pleasure and honor for me, Mr. Laszlo Bruce, on the first place. Okay, maybe you had the opportunity to talk and to introduce. I am here only one participant with this Zoom application, and because of that, only several sentences. Let me introduce myself. I am the professor of chemistry at Belgrade University, and industrial chemistry and mental chemistry, and I am the chief of the chair of applied chemistry at the Faculty of Chemistry. Actually, I'm coming from natural sciences. I'm not a sociologist, it's something similar. And I can say that also on the other side, the vice president of the Democratic Party in Serbia and the president of a committee for the environment in the Democratic Party. Last political election in Serbia in 1st April, I was elected for the Serbian Assembly, for the Serbian Parliament. And now, concerning this very interesting on the first place, sociological topic, and as a chemist and vice president of one democratic party, I would like to present you one example of Serbia. What is the influence of polarization and autocratization to the political system and political situation in Serbia? Of course, as a professor of environmental, I would like to talk about the influence of populist autocratic system on the protection of the environment, and within that on climate trends. Two basic theses are: why are citizens' requests to solve problems ignored in such a system? The second thesis would refer to the complete discrimination of experts in an autocratic regime. And I think that I provide you the answer after this short talk about the real situation, political situation in Serbia today. This year, Swedish institute, the name of that institute is We Them, Varieties of Democracy, qualified Serbia among 6 countries in the world with the highest level of autocratization, together with Brazil, Turkey, Hungary, India, and Poland. 2 of these 6 countries are members of the European Union. According to this report, Serbia is an electoral autocracy whose quality of democracy declined for more than 40% compared to the situation of 10 years ago. Why is this important for us today? The process of autocratization typically follows a pattern, and it has been no different in our case. Ruling government first attacks to media and civil society and polarize by presenting of opponents and spreading harsh information. Only then undermines the elections. This is exactly what has been happening in Serbia for the last 10 years. Ruling regime has taken over most of the media, controls regulatory bodies, and holds the national emitters in its hands. This means not only that there is no space for the opposition and citizens of Serbia on state television with the national frequency, but also that there is no space for professional journalists that would know the citizens everything that is going on in our country. It made it sound unbelievable, and this is something we talk all the time, but there is vast majority of citizens of Serbia who do not know what is the case with a lot of very, how to say, pleasant events in Serbia. Do not be mistaken that the elections held this year change anything. Even to when we are in the we speak given by the president in being broadcasted on the first channel, watched by everyone, and are of speeches of members of are being moved to the less watched channel. Within full control, and I would have to say, satanization of the political opponents, our society become extremely polarized, and I'm afraid that it will be a long process of coming back after current regime lost its power. This polarization is so great that it was possible to use so big force on a peaceful protestant in the front of National Assembly, for example, 2020, to look at the police beat citizens who are peacefully sitting on the bench or continue beating those who are already on the ground without wider reaction. This polarization is so big that it was possible to organize criminals to attack citizens protesting peacefully on Sava Bridge in Shabac with hammers and mechanization, while the police leaves the event knowing that the citizens will have to defend themselves. This polarization is so high that it was possible to kick out children from the kindergarten just because their parents are members of the Democratic Party and their neighbors, other parents, citizens of the same municipality did not rise up their voices to defend them. People are afraid for their own lives and economic existence. Regime holds the media. Violence is rising, polarization at its peak, and it seems like there are no good news. But I think that there are. I believe we managed to create a forced solidarity during the last couple of years, but present at every protest by being there, every citizens whose rights have been violated, by being brave to talk about what is happening. We have seen this during the protest, for example, against Rio Tinto, as the citizens have shown courage and unity like they haven't for a long time. We have a long way to go, but the spark, let's say, is there, and I'm sure that by showing solidarity and persistent choosing the right topics and realistic goals, along with getting the support from our friends all across Europe and entire world, Serbia becomes a democracy and good place to live where citizens see their future. And because of that, now we are not in the situation to talk about some how to say, topics which are very interesting concerning trends and the environment, education, etc., because the real situation in Serbia due to polarization and autocratization is extremely bad. Thank you very much, and I'm open for discussion later.
Thank you so much. We have 15 to 20 minutes more. If any of the panelists would like to add something to the debate right now, I would like to give them the opportunity, but otherwise I would open the floor. Andreas.
Yeah, just one quick but important thing. Katalin, you said, yeah, sometimes you're facing an opponent who really is tearing down democracy. And I think I was thinking about kind of situations we describe as democratic equilibria, established democracies, and which are the dynamics here. Once autocratization is successful, and you are in a either in messy ground or in Hungary, many of us would describe it as an electoral authoritarian regime, then of course it's part of democratic opposition to call the things by their names. And so I think that's a very important difference we need to draw, distinction.
Thanks. Any other panelists now? Then I would like to open the floor for sharp and short questions or comments. Who would like to be the first? Let's see. Yes?
I have a question.
Yeah. Okay. Just a second.
Hello, my name is Attila Szabó. I'm a lawyer from the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union. So I care about human rights. That's my position. And my question would be, what do you think about the social dimension of the polarization? Which social aspects can be important in this process? I would think that the education and the people have a job or don't have a job, and this kind of things might be important. And also the rural and urban aspect might be also important, but I'm very curious about your opinion. And my second question would be what politicians which kind of tools they have to influence these social dimensions and how they can solve the polarization in these different social groups. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any more now? Okay, who would like to start? It's very important. These are questions that are open both to our politicians and scholars in the panel. Katalin? Yeah.
So if you mean the social dimensions in a way that what social differences could be used to further fuel this process, then I would say like really any difference can be blown up to this big quarry between you and someone else. And this is really the master plan, I believe, for some of the autocrats to really try to inflate normal social differences, normal ideas that people might disagree on into this like big and mortal threat to your group. Really dividing society to us and them is absolutely the fundamental baseline for many of the leaders who tend to exploit our differences in order to further their solidification of power. And really it can be anything. You have a hat, I don't have a hat. You are a man, I'm a woman. Anything. The hat, the guys, the people in hats are an opposing group, and the girl in blazers have to be afraid of them because would you force me to wear a hat? No? Why? So really, it can be anything, and this is what we've experienced in Hungary, but also in other countries for the past years. I believe that really if you have a strong enough hold on power, or a strong enough narrative, or a strong enough political strategist, it is very, very easy to pit people just against each other. Of course. Social differences, a country where certain groups are developing better than others can be a clear division of specifying what the threat is, and here, of course, very fundamental and the very basic examples are like, people with different skin colors, people with different religion, people who live somewhere else than you. But I just really want to stress it, or I don't know if the academics agree with me or not, but these groups and these divisions are not fixed and not concrete, and really it can. A polarizing situation can evolve around really basically anything, in my opinion, because fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of the enemy is really so much ingrained in people. It's really at the bottom of the Maslow pyramid, that if you just play hard enough here, people will start to care about problems that are actually not problems at all. And just give you a closing argument, and maybe for you it's obvious, but for those who are non-Hungarians, Hungarians were afraid of migrants in towns where like not one single migrant have arrived, but due to the media effect and due to the political propaganda, it was possible to rally Hungarians against people who are not even in the country, who are not even in their community, who would face like no real threat to them. There is absolutely no connection. So examples like that can be really found all across the spectrum, and the main thing here is try to address the bottom causes of it.
But also that might be linked to polarization, social polarization that was before that. That is, they are afraid of even further insecurities. I think that was your question. Andreas wanted to say something, and then Johanna, and then we open for another question.
Yeah, I think it is a very important question, but a very difficult one. And I don't think we have good answers. From the US literature, the way we have been talking about social polarization is very in a language of, we talk about social or affective polarization, very often with an emphasis on, as the term says it, on emotions. You know, two groups that harbor a hatred against each other, don't like each other. We have feeling thermometers to measure that. We have social dynamics where they start kind of distancing, kind of sorting each other into different residential areas, institutions, etc. Yeah? And very often the kind of the basic theory that undergirds that literature is social identity theory, which basically says what you just said, kind of just draw a difference between two groups and you create these emotional reactions of hatred and competition and etc. I'm a bit doubtful and wary about that. I think that's kind of a soccer theory, a soccer club theory of polarization. Kind of, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be sports. It could be it could be just some item of fashion. I don't think that's the case. I think usually it may be, the problems that ignite these divisions may be imaginary. They may, the crisis, the threat, they may be rhetorical, invented, without real basis in reality, in what we recognize as reality. But I do think that usually these emotions are what psychologists call evaluative emotions. They are grounded in normative judgment. So I am angry against you because you committed some injustice. My indignation comes of my sense that you treat lousily other people, etc. So usually these deep emotions, they have normative. They are fed by normative judgments, and I think it's important to try to understand these in order to be able to do what you also recommended, to open up to dialogue and to not kind of burn the bridges of interaction and dialogue. I myself, from my personal constitution, I'm very much in favor of dialogue, but very much of what we have in the literature tells us it's of no good, it's of no use. People won't listen. So we have a huge literature on motivated reasoning, which is basically telling us, well, people don't kind of just weight arguments and weight evidence and then integrate everything into a fresh judgment. No, they just integrate everything into the world they already have made up in their mind. So they're immune to new arguments, immune to irritations, immune to anything we might be telling them. So that makes us skeptical towards kind of the power of fresh information, dialogue, interaction, etc. So something some colleagues have been telling us that, well, you should do like the mayor of Budapest or of Istanbul, kind of instead of feeding the polarization and engaging with your adversary, just introduce kind of positive narratives, emphasize all the good things you want to do. These are probably, I think, recipes for the local level. At the national level, I think it's important and unavoidable to name the democratic norm violations others are committing, and to really be outspoken about it, but also to be conscious about the difficulties of mobilizing citizens on the basis of these, let's say, democratic grievances, to make them understand what we're talking about, to make them care more about this than about other issues. It's very difficult.
I think, well, I would slightly disagree. I think this is perhaps good for the discussion. What we see in our experiment is that as I said, the socioeconomic issues didn't really move people that much, although we formulated them in a way that it would really affect everyone. Like it was about like income tax, so at least everyone who has an income would be affected, or it was about taxes on different energies. So also everyone has to heat or use electricity somehow. It would affect everyone. Yet people were, even though sometimes they said it's an important issue to them, when we tested whether they would act on this importance or not, we found that they didn't really care so much. They rather than cared about other things, whereas all the, let's say, identity policies issues, these were really much more salient or much more polarizing. And even though I think something like the rights for same-sex couples doesn't really affect that many people, yet it mobilized them so much that even in a country where Spain, where it's more or less consensus, there was no polarization on the rights for same-sex couples, and it doesn't affect maybe 5 to 10% of the people, they disregarded anything else. Like politicians could suggest to prosecute journalists who report badly about the government, or like we had tested various options, as you see in the report, and they would know. But this other thing that's more important. And I think it is, or we are still speculating, and really we only could test the behavior, let's say, and now we are looking forward to the discussions with the sociologists or political psychologists and so on to find out what is it. But we can see from the data it's usually identity issue. And I think, as you said, Kathleen, what we often see then, that if there is actually an economic need, for example, or behind an issue or a concern, that if politicians manage to politicize a certain topic in a way that they frame it as an identity issue, and that's what gets people mobilizing, be it that they are polarizing over it, or that it's just becoming very salient, but like everyone, perhaps in some village in Hungary or also Germany, like everyone's like against the migrants. There's no polarization about migration, basically, because everyone's against it. So, but it's so strong that that they act accordingly. And regarding, we also tested different socioeconomic status or other characteristics of voters in general, how would they act on, if they would tolerate undemocratic behavior. And there we could see differences. We could put people in groups that in general, in all these 7 European countries, we see that women, for example, punish undemocratic behavior more than men do. We see that people who are more trusting, punish more. People who are less authoritarian punish more. And then we have, regarding age, for example, mostly, yes, younger people punish more, but not in all countries. We have a couple of countries where it's not the case, and also in Germany, for example, it's actually the boomers generation that punishes more than young people. And then we have a very, very interesting finding for Poland, which is only in Poland, the people who have a lower economic status, let's say, who assess their own family's economic status or the country's economic prospects, badly, they punish much more, like clearly. And that's really interesting. In all the other countries, it's the more well-off people who punish more. So I think it's diverse and depending on the country, so we can't always generalize, and it's really important to look, at the different people and professions, backgrounds, and so on, if we really want to, find a strategy.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I also must say I disagree with Andreas, because I'm a fan of social identity theories, because I think that we really need to change our assumption about human nature, because there is a lot of research in psychology and neuroscience saying that how this in-group, out-group thinking is innate to us, that we are really, its tribalism is innate to us. We have also back from the 70s, when you had the famous Teifel's experiment, who showed how it's easy to mobilize one group against the other group, and even on some totally meaningless criteria. And I think that political entrepreneurs, they know that very well, and this is why they are successful. And because these group identities and group belonging does mean a lot to the people. And I will only name one example from our study. Basically, we see in Spain that people would not sacrifice democracy if you would promise them to pay less taxes. So basically, to have more money in their pocket. But they would sacrifice democracy if you would ban Catalan people to speak Catalan when communicating with state offices. And this basically affects maybe one person in this state institution that would have to learn Catalan or that would have to hire a translator, and nobody else from the majority, but they would still sacrifice democracy so that the minority speakers would not have right to use their language when communicating with state. So I think this is one of example that shows how this perception of group identity is important to the people. So what can we do about it? I think that political leadership is essential. So basically, in two words, I think we need progressive Orbans who know how to counter these threats.
Thanks. A brief intervention. No, and then you. Sorry, I don't know the names.
Ernst Hillebrand, I'm also from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Just a brief remark on this point because it interests me since years. I would rather go with the academic research. I say that it's not possible to mobilize people along any topic. These topics you can use, they are based on moral and value assumptions that people have. And I can only recommend you to read this marvelous book of Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, which traces back the polarization of American politics to some very basic moral values that underlie the thinking and the judgment of ordinary citizens worldwide. And the problem, he says, with the modern politics is so much of our policy issues today are no longer social issues, economic issues, or other things. They are political questions that are related to moral values of people, and especially the progressive agenda today, I would say, which does no longer insist so much on economic and social questions, but much more on value issues, has been pushing the field of politics very deeply into the field of moral assumptions, moral values. And that's this pushing of the political agenda into these moral and social cultural questions that has been giving the raw material to for this reactionary conservative backlash and this very successful strategy of polarizing society, putting good people against each other. I think that's, and we have to understand the mechanism. The mechanism is because it is about very deep-rooted moral judgments of people. It's not anything. It's not having to wear a hat or not. These are much deeper-rooted, hardwired moral values that are concerned here. And really, read this book. It's marvelous and very eye-opening. Thank you.
Please pass over to behind you.
Thank you. I would just like to ask a question about the tools. I mean, I don't know if you at all took a deep look into it, but in this theory that you're presenting in this study, what role do the digital tools play in actually, building up this theory? I was wondering if you could comment on this, because as far as I understand, also national populists do have a much better domain of the superficial message, like in this sense of identity messages and stuff. And this is the easiest message to spread in a tweet or in a Facebook post or whatever, and somehow the progressive message is a bit more complex and not so much superficial and easy to disseminate. And I was wondering if you believe that the progressive political options and civil society organizations are in disadvantage compared to the more national populistic options, and especially with regard to use of technologies.
We have -2 minutes to answer this question. Who is going to just very brief answer to this question? Joanna?
Ernst, thanks for the recommendation. I'll have to read the book. I've read only a couple of essays, but yeah, I agree with these findings. Regarding the questions, no, we had a very, let's say, tight frame of how to do this experiment. It was really about voting behavior, because that's the way where you can punish politicians. The only aspect that we found was we asked people whether they used whether they were politically engaged, and we gave them a couple of options to tick. And what we saw, also very surprisingly, no explanation for that, is that people who are more politically engaged, but in general it wasn't many people at all who were politically engaged, but they punish less. Why that is, I don't know, and then among these engagement there were also a possibility to be active or post your views, like political views, on social media. Do you do this? And if they do this, they're even less likely to be otherwise politically engaged. So, and then even on top, they punish undemocratic behavior less. So, and we also saw that sometimes, people who vote for other parties than the ones we selected, or sometimes non-voters would also perhaps punish more. They're actually more, active.
Okay, Catherine, really brief.
Yes, just very briefly. So I just want to say that I essentially agree with your analysis. I just wanted to say that, of course, the values underneath all conflicts are really these like moral, basic fundamental divisions. But I just wanted to make a point about, I think nowadays with the internet and with our societies, the divisions in which these divisions and these fears are manifesting are much more complex and much more diverse compared to what it used to be. So it's not only like, where do you live, where do you study, which is your religion, but there can be like really fights about, if you just go on the internet, it's like vegans versus meat eaters. Do you like this series or not? Which character are you rooting for? There are just so many manifestations, I believe, of the same fears and same divisions that it can really appear at very, very unexpected places. So that is what I wanted to say, but I will also read the book. And
let me add that polarization around such moral issues can be a very important tool for democratization. Think of Martin Luther King or other movements similar to that. The last thing that remains to me is to thank the panelists, the exciting contributions, and for you, for your patience and wonderful questions, and enjoy the remaining sessions of this forum. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. And goodbye from Belgrade.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for your patience and excuse me for this 10 minutes delay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Warm welcome to this panel, which is dedicated to the topic of Ukraine's European integration and potential accession. This will be a truly hybrid panel with 2 in-person participants and 2 speakers joining us as online. And I am delighted to introduce our distinguished speakers today. First, Hanna Hopko, a foreign policy expert, former member of the Verkhovna Rada and its chairwoman of its Foreign Affairs Committee between 2014 and 2019. Hanna, welcome. We will be also joined by Viola Kramon von Taubadel, a member of the European Parliament, of its Foreign Affairs Committee, also member of the delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee, and a former EU policy speaker of the Green Caucus in the German Bundestag. Also, Jan-Philipp Albrecht, who is already with us, co-president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and András Rácz, associate fellow in the German Council on Foreign Relations. And my name is Daniel Hegedűs. I work as Transatlantic Fellow for the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and it's my utmost pleasure to be able to moderate this meeting today. Just very briefly about the housekeeping rules. So we will start with a moderated discussion on the topic of Ukraine's European prospects in approximately 45 to 50 minutes. And then we will open up a public Q&A. So I would like to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to prepare your questions because you will definitely have the opportunity to address them to our distinguished speakers. Since the 24th of February, Ukraine has been fighting a historic war for its independence, for its statehood, for its right to self-determination, and also for its sheer existential survival against the Russian aggression. And I think it would be an understatement to say that this war changed many things in Europe. But it definitely changed the European Union's relations with Ukraine. The country is not part of the association trio anymore. As a matter of fact, no such thing as association trio exists. The Ukrainian government applied for EU membership on February 28, and on the 23rd of June, the European Council granted Ukraine a candidate status in the European Union. And I'm convinced that this is more than just a symbolic move, because Ukraine's European integration is practically unfolding before our very eyes at a rather fast pace. Ukraine entered a completely custom-free trade relationship with the European Union, so practically the free movement of goods is already achieved, even if officially only for a temporal period. Ukraine became connected to the European electricity grid and electricity market, and the European Commission is contemplating with the idea how Ukraine could become also part of the roaming-free European telecommunication zone. So Ukraine's European integration is not a matter for the future, but it's unfolding in these present days. However, we also know from the experiences in the Western Balkans that EU geopolitical interests may fade, that reform enthusiasm of candidate countries may weaken, and that political fatigue can paralyze accession processes. And against that background, I would like to ask you to start with a sort of reality check, perhaps. And the same question to all of our speakers would be first that what is, according to your opinion, a both desirable but also realistic and feasible scenario for Ukraine's European integration in the next 5 years? And what should the European Union, its member states, and Ukraine do and achieve to realize the scenario you desire? And potentially we could start with you, Ms. Hopko.
Thank you so much for organizing this important discussion. And I think really historical event happened this June when Ukraine received a candidate status. And I remember in May and June when we traveled within our International Center for Ukrainian Victory to key capitals, Berlin, Paris, The Hague, also Brussels, to convince the decision makers that granting Ukraine a candidate status does not contradict the enlargement process of the Western Balkans, because all countries will be equal in this process, and Ukraine met the criteria, so actually we deserve, not just because of Russian full-scale escalation, but also because the reforms we implemented after the Euromaidan dignity revolution, it's also very convincing just to grant us the EU candidate status. And it also was a geopolitical signal to Russian Federation and to Kremlin, which also determine Ukraine's victory in Russian aggression, weapon supply, sanctions, and EU perspective, and I do hope also NATO after Ukrainian victory. It's also not just symbolic, but it's also one of the key elements of our victory. And also behind the Russian war against Ukraine and actually Putin's attempt to return Ukraine back in Russian sphere of influence, giving a European perspective, just reaffirmed that EU is a geopolitical player, which is, I think, really important for European Union to be positioned not just economic union. And actually today, Ukrainians are united and mobilized as never before, and 91% of the population support the EU integration. 93% of Ukrainians believe and confident that Ukraine is winning the war, and the victory in Ukraine's view is full restoration of territorial integrity and sovereignty in the international recognized borders 1991. So Ukrainians are fighting, risking and giving their lives to remain independent country with European values. And I think it's really important that we are defending not just the independence of Ukraine, but also we are contributing to global, I would say, security, not just preventing the devastation going beyond Ukrainian borders, and not allowing authoritarian regime to attack in hybrid warfare methods. So, and also, if we discuss about, you already mentioned roaming and others. So Ukraine is already deeply integrated into the EU internal market. 63% of the objectives under the association agreement completed. Ukraine has proven that it is able to proceed with sectoral integration at the accelerated pace, even in time of Russian full-scale war genocide. So you mentioned ENSUI, energy system. So after I think also it's very important that Ukraine join in the European continental energy grid, and especially with what's happening now with nuclear terror, when Russian military forces are in the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and recent attacks on Yuzhno-Ukrainska nuclear power plant. So it's a terror, nuclear terror, and we are advocating. I just came back from Washington, D.C. I visited last week with the idea, with the key goals to recognize Russian aggression as a genocide and designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. And after today's decision of Putin, he needs 300,000 more soldiers to die for what? What does Russia stand for? Just to be killed for what is the biggest idea of this? So I think Putin lost Ukraine and this higher level of support, 91% of the population for EU integration. It's also important. Also, let's mention the trade and economy, new market and business for the EU, and as a guarantor of food security to European states, we really fight very tough to deblockade the Black Sea and demilitarize, because grain deal is a just partial solution. It's not a real solution in long term. And I'm sure that Ukraine, with around 32 million hectares of land, with almost 24% of all EU arable land, it really could become a global security or food security guarantor, which is really important. And Green Deal, climate change, everyone is talking here. But I made also, there were also discussion today in the morning about the role of renewables in helping democracy to counter the fossil fuel authoritarian regime and what is happening now with energy crisis in EU, which Russia provoked, because the weaponization of energy with gas, and we were fighting against the Nord Stream 2 for many years. So it's really important that Ukraine with renewable, Ukraine has a higher potential for renewables, and potential also increased to 70% by 2050. So there are many other facts where we could say that Ukraine, as a not candidate state, but in the nearest future as a member of the EU, it's will be, how to say, for both sides. So we will strengthen the EU as a also spiritual or basket of Europe, not just it used to be in last century a food basket of Europe, but also as a values defender, also as a security, because Ukraine armed forces are de facto European armed forces. And it's really important that we will share our unique practical experience in conventional war and hybrid warfare. So the plan of Ukrainian president, our government with Vice Prime Minister Olga Stefanishyna, after candidate status, to implement 7 commitments and all legislation, and to, how to say, to progress, and that after candidate status, the membership will not take, like for other countries, decades. And I think it's in the interest of both Ukraine and the European Union, because I do believe that European Union becoming a geopolitical player, it's in the interest of democracy, democracy sustainability in long term.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hopko. Mr. Albrecht, where do you see Ukraine's accession process in 5 years, and what do you think which goals can be realistically achieved in a mid-term, approximately 5 years long period? You have the floor.
First of all, let me thank you very much for the invitation and the occasion to speak about this very important question, not only for Ukraine, but for the European Union and the Western partners in general, because we have to first and foremost achieve that there is a clear alliance uphold to support the Ukrainian people in their struggle in this war, but also to open up perspectives on how we build up a new era of a common interest policy area, including Ukraine, in several fields. And I think if you ask like for what's desirable and realistic, then I think it's important to say that we need to have quick progress in many areas in order to foster not only the support for also the Ukrainian economy, which is needed, and the integration, for example, of the energy infrastructure into the European infrastructure, but also in order to really build up a common understanding of how to integrate our policy decisions in this new era. And that means that we need to accelerate in some areas the accession procedure, and to also make it possible to already agree on common standards and apply them even before the full membership is fully enabled, but to also not forget that the whole procedure, of course, needs to be brought forward in a quick manner and that the clear aim and agreement is the full membership of Ukraine in the European Union. And that is what has to lead us in the upcoming time, where we all know that, of course, there is still work to be done in several areas, and that means also, by the way, on both sides, because also inside the European Union, the change of situation in which we all are requires for new reform attempts, especially in the field of foreign and security policy, but also in many economic issues. We see the dependencies on the energy market, which we have to address commonly. We see the necessity to not only look at our approach towards Russia, but also the question, how do we deal with other dependencies arising, like vis-a-vis China? And we have to also address in parallel necessary reforms which are equally important, like, for example, the energy transition and many transformation questions we have to answer. And in this regard, the chance of this accelerated accession procedure is also to already build up new mechanisms and also build up maybe a new level of integration in the European Union, and therefore achieve also added value for the European partners and for the people in the European Union with this accession procedure of Ukraine. That is what I think would be most desirable, but also possible and realistic, which means, of course, also that we have to look on other accession procedures we have to handle in parallel, for example, on the Western Balkans, also Georgia. So we have to look at the whole region, which we are looking at the moment, where influence is taking place, also in various ways from different parts of the world, and we have to face that commonly as Europeans, and that includes the view of the Ukrainian people. And therefore, I think one of the next and the most important steps on this procedure is also to achieve a political integration in the way how we discuss together these challenges and the approaches towards our partners, towards the economic and energy questions, and that we try to get these debates, which we are having right now here, also into the capitals of the European Union member states and into the European institutions, in order to strengthen and deepen dialogue on the very important perspectives Ukraine is bringing into the European decision-making processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Albrecht, and thank you, Ms. Kramon, for joining our panel. We are conducting a reality check of Ukraine's EU aspirations, and the central question is what is both a feasible and realistic goal for this integration process in the next 5 years. But potentially I will also add a further question to that for you, and that is that based on all of the lessons learned from the Western Balkan, how can the European Union keep the credibility of the integration process alive? And how can the European Union act in a responsible way to act disillusionment in Ukraine sooner or later, which will kick in if there will be not sufficient progress in the accession procedure? Thank you so much, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to all the other panelists who have already spoken, Jan Philipp and Hannah. I mean, there was a lot of input regarding the integration process for Ukraine. And I think one has to be honest, without the war, there would not be this immediate chance for Ukraine to ever get or to ever receive this candidate status at that moment. I mean, this is clear. I would say the European Union actually reacted much faster, much more swiftly, much more smarter than we have expected, let's say, the beginning of the war. So I think that especially Ursula von der Leyen and we in the European Parliament understood perfectly that we have to act as a geopolitical player. I mean, you see now how Putin tries to interfere and tries to create this fake referendum to make sure you create facts. And even I was at the beginning very, let's say, skeptical whether this EU integration process would be a doable solution and would be also for the European Union or for us in the parliament something we should really lobby for. Well, I see that at the moment we need to win the war, we need to send weapons, we have to look after IDPs and refugees and all the other things related to the war. But now I think, and we have to support this EU integration process, as Jan said, in a parallel track. We really need to see that we try to bring the Ukraine plus the Western Balkan states into the European Union as fast as possible. But Daniel, you're absolutely right. It is a merit-based process, and even after the reforms were implemented and after the criteria were fulfilled and the criteria or expectations were met, the EU has not delivered when it came to the Western Balkans, and there is a huge frustration. And when you look through the long-term service, especially in some of the countries of the Western Balkans, the expectation or the so-called pro-Western, pro-European, pro-EU attitude in the wider or broader population is increasingly or is significantly decreasing. And that is extremely worrying. So we have to find ways how, without switching off the merit-based process, but at least with keeping our promises, we can kick back in. As we actually promised in 2003. That was something, I guess, where high expectations were raised, where a lot of people thought, okay, if we go one reform after the other, even if we go some steps back, but there is a realistic way. And especially in those countries such as North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and so on, you have seen significant reforms or progress, and still the door is not really open and it was not really speed up, and the situation was stuck. How to prevent this from happening, how to avoid that? I would say, even as I said, I was rather skeptical, was rather critical at the beginning with Ukraine. I would very much lobby for integrating Ukraine as fast as we can, as swiftly as we can. I mean, we have a lot of very reliable partners in Ukraine. We had a lot of very strong NGOs. We have players like Hannah and many others. We have very good counselors on the local level, on the municipal level, in the cities. I heard, for example, we had an extremely good, well-attended Ukraine event last night, somewhere out here in Lower Saxony, not far away from where Mr. Albrecht came from. And you know, the first thing people ask me, but how is it with corruption? Everyone who has been to Ukraine is kind of addicted to how do we solve this problem. And so my intention is to say, yes, we will give, during the reconstruction process, a lot of money to Ukraine. But believe me, it is in our interest. It is in the interest of the people of Ukraine. It is in the interest of many people in Ukraine that we allocate the money where it is supposed to go, where it is needed, and so on. So, I mean, it must be in the interest of the Ukrainian government, of the municipal governors and councillors and mayors and so on, to make sure that we have a transparent process in that, and that the credibility also from the Ukrainian side is really safeguarded by a transparent, process, by some external monitors and people like this. So I would be very optimistic, at least for this window of opportunity, to make sure to get Ukraine into the first phase or first steps. But for me, still at the moment, it is the priorities is for the hardware and to make sure that Ukraine can win this war and will get this or can liberate the territory. But you're absolutely right. The dilemma and the failures we have done with the Western Balkan state for quite some time, where especially now Mr. Vučić, together with Edi Rama, try to create an alternative track, try to create something regional, some new cooperation, but without values, without standards, without EU accession aspiration, but rather to make sure that they do not rely on the EU. And this should not happen, of course, with Ukraine. And we should also make an effort to get the Western Balkans back on track as soon as possible. I would limit it to that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kramen, for your insights. And András, what are the conclusions of your reality check? Especially, Ms. Kramen mentioned several times that obviously the real short-time priority should be Russia's military defeat. What do you think? How can a candidate status perspective contribute to Ukrainian war efforts? And how illusionary to be appear accession expectations from a down-to-earth frontline perspective?
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and see Hanna again, despite of the war. Kind of a remark in the beginning, everything that I'm going to say here constitutes solely and exclusively my own personal opinion. So it shall not be taken as an official position of any institution, country, or any other entity. And Dani, you made my life a lot easier by giving this 5 years time perspective. Because if you look at the 5 years, Mr. Putin's decision, not today, actually yesterday, it was just only televised today, but the decision was taken yesterday already. This decision, by mobilizing at least 300,000 reservists, we will see how many of them will be deployed and in what time frame. And we will also see whether this is the last mobilization or there will be another one after this 300,000 will be neutralized. But still, this decision made sure that the war is going to last for quite a while more. At least a year more, but perhaps even more. So to think about Dani's time frame of 5 years, at least 1 more year is already taken by the war, but probably more. And when it comes to Ukraine's EU integration in terms of membership, dear colleagues, just remember the Copenhagen criteria. And don't ask me about the membership perspectives. We have a person in the room, former Commissioner Peter Balázs, who knows everything inside out about how a membership negotiation takes place. I'm just a plain military analyst, nothing else. But just think for a second. The third Copenhagen criteria implies that the country trying to join the European Union has to be ready to meet the demands of the European Union once you are inside, absorption capacity. Can you imagine the Ukrainian economy being able to stand the free trade competition on the European market, even 5 years from now? I mean, if you ask me to be realistic, that's what I'm doing. I really don't see that Ukraine in 5 years, even if all the institutional aspects could be checkmarked, I really don't see that Ukrainian economy would be ready to meet the third Copenhagen criteria. Not to mention things like functioning democracy, functioning economy. Dear colleagues, Ukraine is at war, state of war. And if you're in a state of war, it's absolutely normal in a state of war to suspend opposition parties, to ban opposition parties, to ban critical media that might serve the enemy. Coming out from a state of war, it's not like switching the light on and off. If you spend a year in a state of war, it has a massive damage on the institutional systems of democracy. You cannot restore a functioning multi-party system in just like this when the war comes to an end, whenever that happens. So we need to be really realistic about the perspectives, not to mention the economic and infrastructural and human aspects. Ukraine lost significant part of its economy in the war. 20% of the territory occupied, most of the heavy industry is already destroyed, the rest is in the process of being destroyed by Russia's military strikes. This is not something that you can fix in 5 years' time. And by the way, no country has ever made it in 5 years. No Central and Eastern European country. So we need to be realistic about the perspectives. And of course, from the political perspective, I fully agree. We need to speak about the perspective of a long-term full membership. But when it comes to a 5 years time period, we need to be realistic about expectations. And here comes the good news. Do you remember Romano Prodi and his famous motto about neighborhood policy? Everything but the institutions. We can give everything but the institutions. And personally, I think that this is the direction we shall go to in the next 5 years. Because institutional membership, even if that ever happens, it should not going to happen in 5 years' time. And by the way, just imagine how the accession of Ukraine, a country of 40 million, how the accession of Ukraine would turn power relations inside the EU completely upside down. Do we really see the support for that inside the EU in 5 years' time? I don't. But if we approach the problem from the perspective like everything but the institutions, we need to do the best we can. And I fully agree with what Hanna said. The EU finally turned out to be a geopolitical actor, and the EU is faring pretty well. If anybody would have told me a year ago that Ukraine would get the candidate status, that the EU would adopt 7 packages of sanctions against the Russians in less than 6 months' time, if you would ever told me, anybody a year ago, that the European Union will finance weapons deliveries to an ongoing conflict from EU money, because this is happening, I wouldn't have believed a single bit of it. So the EU's approach and the EU's policies are changing and changing for the better. But what it takes to become a member, it's an institutionalized legal process. There is no shortcut. You have to meet all the requirements, you have to adopt the laws, you have to implement the laws, you have to monitor the whole process, and it's a long, long bumpy road. It has been a long bumpy road even for such countries which were not torn apart by Russia's aggression. So if we focus on the logic of everything but the institutions, the first task is to keep Ukraine in the fight and help Ukraine winning the war. This requires immense amount of money, effort, resilience from our side, and also the readiness to take up the hardships that are awaiting us. Because Ukrainians are fighting in the trenches, dying in the trenches, and we keep doing so for quite a while. But our population will also suffer, particularly during the coming winter. Quite likely also the next winter. So this is not a free lunch for us either. We need to keep up the popular support also inside the EU to keep supporting Ukraine. Remember, everything but the institutions, immense amounts of money, immense amounts of political support. We need to move forward with the sanctions regime as well. If there is one or more EU government that would block the adoption of upcoming sanctions, no problem. Right now, the most important thing to be done with the sanctions is actually to patch the holes in the sanctions regimes. Because there are quite many holes in the implementation of the sanctions. So even without adopting a 7th or 8th or 10th sanctions package, there is still a lot that we could do, for example, when it comes to export control and dual-use technologies and things like this. So immense amount of financial support, political support, economic support, because in 5 years' time, the biggest task in the relation of Ukraine and the EU will not be the EU membership. It will be the reconstruction. In 5 years from now, hopefully, the EU will be one of the biggest donors of Ukraine's reconstruction. And about the amounts we are talking here, estimates vary. And of course, you cannot really fully fathom the situation on the Russian-occupied territories. But even the lowest estimates are around $800 billion, and the war is not yet over. So this is really a long-term commitment, long run from our side as well. And here I'm finishing with the good news. Another good news, see? The good news here is that whatever the final objective is, full membership, or something like the situation of Norway, which is institutionally not a member, but fully integrated to the single market, to visa-free, basically all the four freedoms apply to Norway, is just not a member. Whichever will be the final direction, full membership whenever it happens, or some kind of a very closed economic infrastructural integration, but without institutional membership, the road towards that is largely the same. In the next 5 years, we need to do basically the same, regardless of what the final outcome is. So for the next 5 years, I think these are the perspectives. And yes, of course, we need to maintain the support for European integration and approximation, both inside the Ukrainian population, but also in our populations. And that's going to be quite a challenge. So if you want me to do a reality check, this is my reality check. I hope it helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, András. And as a matter of fact, you raised the issue of incremental integration. And that was also a proposal made by the European Stability Initiative for the European Commission, just to follow the blueprint of the Norway model, but without direct financial payments from the Ukraine, practically paying for the access to the internal market. And against that background, I would like to ask you, Ms. Hopko, what would be the Ukrainian perception of such political developments? How desirable could such a model be for Ukraine, that instead of having a full-fledged representation within the European institution, the country could have potentially, even in a shorter period of time, access, but a full access to the EU internal market and all of the four freedoms?
Thank you so much for this question. So Ukraine is a member of European family. The question is when we will become a member of the European Union. So, and it's like during the period when we were advocated for candidate status, there are many ideas to give us like how to say hybrid version, like remember potential candidate status for candidate status and others. We refused, and we campaigned for a candidate status and not to how to say invent a new hybrid reality within the EU institutional and procedure reglement, how to say, like regulations. Yes. So this is why here I also wanted to remind you that in 2019, together with my colleague who is sitting now here, Oksana Yuranets, she used to be the member of Euro Integration Committee. So we incorporated into the constitution of Ukraine a strategic goal for Ukraine to become a full-fledged member of EU and NATO. So there is no options like you mentioned and others, like desirable, not desirable. There is Ukrainian constitution. As a former legislator, I could say that we have to stick what's written and what is incorporated into the constitution. So I think this is the way to go. And let me also use this opportunity to express our gratitude for the tremendous support, immense financial and also political, and especially on the people's level in different EU countries, because I travel a lot within these 7 months, and I see the reaction of people support, helping Ukrainian, I wouldn't even say refugees, but Ukrainian IDPs and others. So this is really, we are very thankful, and we know that this is a marathon, and strategic patience and support and this empathy is key to counter attack Russian hybrid warfare, because it's a war against also Western civilization, not just a genocide against Ukraine. So, and I agree also that accession, so now we are talking about wartime and how to respond all destroyed heating system, water supply, and prepare for winter in Ukraine. It's like a relief during wartime. But then there will be different stages, and post-victory agenda includes reconstruction, and also EU integration process is also, with all reforms we have to adopt and to continue, like judiciary and others. It's really important also to see EU investment in rebuilding Ukraine. And I think this will be also in common interest and with all transparency, accountability mechanisms, because trust is a key. Trust inside Ukraine, because people are suffering a lot. People are dying. Of course, they are dying for better future, for country with rule of law, strong institutions, and people deserve to see electoral democracy. And I'm sure after victory, there will be presidential, parliamentary, plus local elections. And Ukraine, compared to Russia, so we, for all these 30 years of renewed independence, proved that we have free and fair elections. In Ukraine, it's hard to predict who will become a next president of Ukraine. It's in Russia very clear. But in Ukraine, like we could, with two revolutions and others, it's still. So in this case, really, but regarding corruption, I also kindly asking you to help us to fight corruption, because we have a pro-Russian oligarch, Mr. Firtash, who is sitting in Vienna and waiting for extradition to US for last 8 months. 8 years. And it's still, for me, as a reform-minded person, it's hard to understand why. Instead of being in US and responding for all his corruption cases, he is a representative of Russian interest. He is, for 8 years, he's been, I would say, protected by Austrians. And it's a key when we are talking about fighting with oligarchs. And the war, Russian aggression, is when many oligarchs lost. Like recently, Mr. Akhmetov sold his TV channels because he's afraid of de-oligarchization law and others. So I think it's also important for us to rethink, but without strong support from EU, US, and real tough position on oligarchy. This would be really fight, and I do hope that after Canada, they adopted a bill on confiscation of Russian assets. We will see legislation in US, in the European nations, because it's also important source of money for reconstruction and not just investment and others. So I think it's really important. And you mentioned 7 packages of sanctions adopted by the EU. We're also very thankful, but still sanctions could be even tougher. And it's strange that why UK imposed sanctions against Kirill, who is so-called leader of Orthodox Church, and we are very thankful to UK, but EU didn't do this, and we know why. So we also have to be very to honestly answer on question why. Kirill, who is a part of war machine, who was also undermining all efforts of different countries joining to NATO, like Montenegro and others. So it's a part of Russian hybrid warfare machine. And he is not on the sanction list of the EU and Rosatom. Now, when the representatives of these companies, together with Russian military, attacking Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and Rosatom is not a part of Western sanctions, and military industry and Russian oligarchs, they are trying to buy loyalty. Now there is another great idea of Mr. Friedman. He wants to pay $1 billion to get relief of American sanctions. When I read this article last week in the Wall Street Journal, I was like, really, is it fake, or how the Wall Street Journal could even publish this idea? So these wallets of Putin, like Friedman, Aven, and others, they also contributed to genocide against Ukraine. And now they think that it's very easy to buy US or others just for $1 billion. Does democracy cost $1 billion? So when we are talking about the future of democracy, please help Ukraine also to fight with our oligarchs, not to allow Russian oligarchs to use different holes in just to to create a rebirth of Russian empire, because I think the key you mentioned, and I saw the reaction of Viola, that we have to defeat Russia first. But I think it's not just about defeat of Russian regime. We have to shift from regime change to how to de-imperialize Russia. Because with the Soviet Union disintegration in 1991, it was the defeat of communism, but not the defeat of colonialism. And this is like in 30 years of period, we've seen another Russian half an empire attacking Chechnya, attacking Georgia, attacking Ukraine. And it's still strange why Wagner Group are not a terroristic organization. So it's also about question of political will. So there are many tasks when we also expect that we will strengthen a sanction package and we will see unity and we will learn the lessons and with the focus on energy, because it's also, I understand, one of the key important sector, not to allow Russians to blackmail the whole European Union as a geopolitical player.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hopko. Is Ms. Kramon still with us? Okay. Then, Mr. Albrecht, I would like to have a provocative question to you. And I think there is an elephant in the room which wasn't addressed until now today, and this is absorption capacity. And the sheer fact that there are a couple of member states in the European Union which even... Did we also lost him?
I'm here.
Subversive.
Thank you. Then I continue with my question. That we have several member states in the European Union, which even if are not unofficially, but tie the issue of any further enlargement to EU institutional reforms and an extension of the qualitative majority decision making to further areas of EU policies. And we know how hard this nut is to crack, especially because any extension of qualified majority voting needs unanimity in the Council. And then, excuse me, Ms. Kramon, I haven't seen you on the screen, but I'm happy that you are still with us. So then it's a question to both of you. What do you think politically between creating this linkage between EU institutional reform and further enlargement? Ms. Kramon, over to you.
Well, that's a great question, because at least it appears to me that is sometimes being used as an excuse not to go for any further enlargement. I mean, we had the beginning of this discussion for quite some time, and it's rather disappointing for all of us in the European Parliament that almost nothing has happened. The exercise of the Conference for the Future of Europe was, rather lukewarm when it came to the ambition of the Commission and also especially the Council. So there was more an election campaign for President Macron than a real, output-orientated convention. I think it would be good to institutionalize this, to really make it more like a commitment from all the EU institutions. Of course, we need to go forward. We need to work on the reforms. We have to find a way how to overcome this unanimity challenge and problem and everything else, which was mentioned many times, the numbers of the commissioners and so on, and how to really become a more executive power here. But nevertheless, I think to start an enlargement process with Ukraine, also to intensify the enlargement process with the Western Balkan countries, should not be linked to the domestic reforms or the interinstitutional reforms, because then it will be blocked forever. And then I would see, at least in the Western Balkan states, and I guess Hannah would agree, there is no, inspiring moment for those countries to really work on reform if they, in the end, need to wait until the EU has reformed itself or the reform has even implemented. But I would object maybe one thing which Mr. Andras has mentioned, and that is related to, let's say, the abolition of democracy while you're in a war situation. I fully understand that you have to face own security, let's say, threats in the country in a different way than during peace times. But if you, let's say, suspend the most patriotic parties and make their life difficult and really concentrate the power only to the president, even you are a parliamentary democracy, and you create like almost a one-man show, even you see that in wartime, there are so many actors working hand in hand, and Ukraine survives because they have a decentralized state, because they have strong mayors, because they have a strong general commander, because they have good parties in the parliament. But you see, the vertical power is, let's say, really, I mean, almost. It's of course not Russia. I would not dare to compare that. But the last steps which the presidential administration has taken, I think, were not the right ones to really get the majority of the people behind you. And that would, at least, worries me a lot. I understand the military situation is, how to say, ask for different, let's say, structures, but nevertheless, it needs a checks and balances. It needs a better oversight and so on. And especially when we speak about money flowing into the country, that cannot just go from, let's say, more of one institution as it is managed right now.
Thank you, Ms. Kremon. Mr. Albrecht, how do you see the linkage between EU institutional reform and enlargement? You have the floor.
I agree to the point that there shouldn't be a precondition of EU reform linked to the enlargement process. But in the same time, we have to say that a long time it was the other way around, that deepening and reform in the institutions was linked to the fact that we had enlargement and we couldn't process and progress with it. And that would be wrong in the same way as we see, for example, with the point brought forward on the approach to the sanctions and like how do we approach also in judicial cooperation, the role of oligarchs, and how do we enforce coherently our decisions. We need to have more common decisions done in a more effective way in the European Union in order to address these challenges. So deepening of the cooperation on these matters in the European Union is key. And we all know that the success of the European Union as an idea and the structure is bound to stronger integration and reform, and that this needs to be done, and that we still have to fight for that together also, as there are forces in the European Union and in Europe as a whole also trying to get this put on a long bench or even dismantle the integration which we already achieved in the European Union. So it's both necessary, and therefore it's important to mention both, but there's no precondition to it. On the other hand, I would like to also say that while I'm very much in favor of being really ambitious about the accession procedure and being early with some of the fields being implemented, I agree to the fact that in some of the fields, the road is still ahead of us, and it's a stony road of integration and applying standards which were mentioned also to Ukraine, and implement them on the basis of laws and many measures which needed to be taken. So we shouldn't also send wrong expectations, which also makes it even more problematic if at a certain moment there will be a fatigue on some of the fields. We can see, as I said, some areas where it can be accelerated and where things can be brought forward quicker also, as we have seen that in other accession procedures. But there are fields maybe also regarding, for example, judicial procedures and corruption aspects, where we need to look at things being done in the right way, also on long term. And we should be honest about that and do expectation management in a way that there won't be such a fatigue, but be very clear on the fact that this procedure is a very serious one, and that we are not looking at it as a show procedure, which in the end might be ending up in no result, but that we mean it. And that is important also for Ukraine and the perspective we are having together with Ukraine. I have to be honest on that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Albrecht. I still have a long list of questions, but wouldn't like to monopolize the right to ask questions to our speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Q&A is open. Please raise your hands if you have any question and introduce yourself also briefly. I don't know whether we have a walking microphone. Then, please, first Daniel and then the gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Barta. I'm president of Center for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Democracy. I would have a question, but first a very short comment, because I'm always tempted in these panels when we are talking about the sanctions and Kirill and Rosatom. The question is that why the US is not doing it. Because if US would do it, we can wait for the Europe forever that we find a solution, but it would be super easy if the United States would put them on the sanction list. Then it would be automatic in the European Union as well, because the companies here would be afraid of doing business with Rosatom. And I'm sure that even local banks in countries such as Hungary would be hesitant to work with Rosatom. But that's just a comment. My question would go for another country, which is there, and we heard a lot that double standards and the Western Balkans when it comes to accession, but there is another country who got the candidate status, and that is Moldova. And we talked about the special status of Ukraine and why we should introduce special rules for the accession because of for Ukraine. But would that mean that Moldova would? Do you think Moldova should automatically negotiate under the same rules? And if not, why not? So that's, I think, a tough question, whether we can handle these countries in a similar way, whether would Moldova receive the similar conditions as Ukraine during this process on the road towards EU membership? And if not, on what basis we should differentiate?
Thank you, Daniel. I would suggest to gather 3 questions, and then we can make a final round with our speakers. And there were 2 questions there on the right side, the left bank.
Thank you. My name is Tivador Balázs. I'm a freelancer. And my question is that whether joining the EU Persecution Agency is a prerequisite at the moment for new members, for candidates, and if it is so, if you think that that's a good enough guarantee to avoid big corruption after joining the EU.
Thank you so much. And the last question there on the right side.
I am Murat Hasanov, alumni of CU. I have a question to Mr. Andras. He told about the accession criteria, but for example, I think that the EU is more political project. For example, Cyprus, yes, the sides are different, but Cyprus was divided, but it was accepted, or acceptance of Eastern European countries were more political than, or non-accession of Turkey. Sometimes it's criticized as politically motivated decision rather than economic or other things. What would you think about it? What's your comment on it?
Thank you so much. I would suggest to make a last round, and I would like to ask you to keep your responses concise. So we have had 3 questions. The third one about the roles of borders. in the accession procedure, there was a question to the treatment of Moldova in comparison to Ukraine, and whether membership in the European Public Prosecutor's Office can be conditioned for candidate countries. András, would you mind to start? Because there was a direct question also to you.
Thank you. Regarding Mr. Hassanov's question on Cyprus, Turkey, and all the others, sir, I have no clue. I mean, I'm a Russia specialist, Russia-Ukraine specialist. I know nothing about the accession procedures of the other countries, and I don't want to pretend that I do when I don't. So I'm very sorry. That's the expertise of somebody else. When it comes to Moldova and for a separate track, this is part of the problems. I mean, and particularly when it comes to the 5 years perspective, what to do with Moldova. And personally, I would be against too much segmentation of the accession procedure, because the more we segment, the more separate tracks we create, while all the separate tracks are supposed to lead to the same final direction. So the more we segmentate the accession process, the more complicated our own life becomes. And another argument for not making Moldova an exception is what Mr. Albrecht said, that the accession process is not a TV show. It's not something that we can speed up. No, it's an institutional process. So in the very end, I'm against making too much exceptions for Ukraine as well. And if we don't make exceptions for Ukraine, we shall not make exceptions to Moldova either, which is another argument against further segmentation. And again, instead of, I mean, what Hanna, you said that it's in the Ukrainian constitution that the country's aspiration is full EU and NATO membership. I'm going to be a troll here, but you cannot create a path dependency for the EU from the outside. I mean, imagine North Korea writes into its own constitution. So this is not an argument that functions. Because whatever is in the constitution of a neighboring country, that constitution doesn't affect the European Union. That constitution affects the given country. So instead of using this argument, I would go, and this applies also to Moldova, for a lot more existential arguments. Because people often ask the question what the EU can give to Ukraine. Let me ask the question the other way around. What we can get from Ukraine and also from Moldova in the spirit of mutual cooperation and mutual benefits. Labor force. We are on the right track. I mean, if you look at the recent OECD paper on the effects of the Ukrainian asylum seekers coming to Europe, the likely GDP growth, thanks to the asylum seekers, is somewhere between 0.2 or 0.4%. It's substantial. Because many of the Ukrainians who came to Europe will stay and will contribute to our own economy. Here is a benefit. We need the labor force. That's why it's important that we liberalize the visa regimes. That's why we give visa-free travel. And this is something we should pursue further. Agricultural resources, what Hanna said. Ukraine has immense strategically important assets, which we need. So, okay, let's go forward with liberalizing access to the EU agricultural market, because we need Ukraine's agricultural products. And there are a lot more such things. And when we speak about the joint roaming zone for cell phones, it's not only because we are nice to Ukraine, it's also because Ukraine is a fairly big market. So there is the mutual interest here as well. One can define several areas of fully mutual interests where we can deepen cooperation without actually giving Ukraine full membership. So, and the same thing applies to Moldova, on a smaller scale, of course, but the overall logic shall be the same. I hope that goes for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, András. Ms. Kramon? Please feel free to select any of the questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. András' answer was rather provoking, but also very honest. I think it's good to hear a very interest-driven reply for the question of what can Moldova and Ukraine give to the EU. I mean, everything which makes this continent more peaceful, more stable, more, how to say, socially coherent would be a benefit for all of us. I mean, you said asylum seekers. I don't think that most of the people coming now bordering the EU are asylum seekers. They're mainly refugees. And if you say that most of them or some of them will stay, yes, I see this, but also with a kind of a crying eye as well, because Ukraine will need them. And they are losing so many people to different sides, and some will never return. But I also do hope that many of them from the EU labor market, even we can need them, they would return. Well, when it comes to Moldova, I actually heard, of course, there will be no split with Ukraine, there will be no separate track. But for Moldova, even they're in a huge economical crisis, and even it is political rather fragile. I mean, they proceed with their reforms, and there would be no need to have let's say, a more cautious track when it comes to Moldova. And Moldova, of course, has the advantage, and that's sorry to say, but it's rather small, and it's very close to Romania, and they have really, I mean, this would be rather easy for the EU to digest. So with Moldova, I have not heard a single voice who would have a problem to say, of course, can manage to include Moldova into the European domestic market. With Ukraine, and I'm absolutely sure we will not give them any discount in terms of criteria. But what we have seen from inside, even during wartime, Ukrainians are willing to reform. And that is, I think, where we have to see how much we can support them. Of course, 5 years is not a realistic period, but nevertheless, you see how many people are working on this accession path. And I think for us, it is important to make sure that Ukrainians have the hope and the realistic belief that in the end, if they implement the reform and if they can deliver on what we had asked them for, they have a real chance to join. And so, I don't know. I mean, the war is overshadowing everything at the moment. We all suffer a lot, as you have rightly said. But in the end, I think from the geostrategical point of view, I think the EU accession will be crucial. Otherwise, Ukraine will always be the target of the bigger neighbor, I'm pretty sure.
Thank you, Ms. Kramon. Mr. Albrecht?
Yeah, to make sure I'm short, I'm agreeing with a lot of things being said, and I really think that, of course, we all know that this all is a political project, but it is also based on treaties and principles and a lot of very detailed standards built up after years and decades. And that, of course, the accessions procedures today cannot be compared with several moments in the past in the same way. But we also see that reform can be done. Accession procedures can be accelerated on the basis of the understanding that, of course, the criteria have to be met in a certain way. And that is the important part. We have to support those on the track in the best way possible. And the European public prosecutors and other structures, that's important. It's a crucial element to fight corruption and organized crime in Europe. But it's not like sufficient in the end to only do that, because there's far more when you look at independent judicial procedures at independent courts and also police and law enforcement measures which need to be done. So that's key to work on that. And we're working on that also inside the European Union. We all know that we need those things to be built up, and we should do our best in order to support those institutions and infrastructure to be built up, and look at the realistic perspective on what we can achieve and in which time, but not lay back and wait or politically underestimate the geopolitical role, as Viola said, this all plays.
Thank you so much, Mr. Albrecht. And before I would give the floor to Ms. Hopko to hold the closing words, I just in a minute would like to address the question related to the European Public Prosecutor's Office. EPPO is a so-called enhanced cooperation, which means that it's not obligatory for EU member states, and therefore it also cannot be set as a condition for candidate countries. However, Ukraine could ask for a permission to join the European Public Prosecutor's Office. And as a matter of fact, this could definitely mitigate, for example, donors' concerns when it comes to reconstruction donations to the Ukraine. The German Marshall Fund, we published just at the beginning of September a document called Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And this was one of our core recommendations, that there should be an opportunity for a voluntary participation of Ukraine in the European Public Prosecutor's Office, because that could be a solution for a transparent reconstruction process. And based on our European legal investigations, from a legal perspective, it's possible. And having said that, Ms. Hopko, your closing words.
Thank you so much. What I would like to say, that in Ukraine, we do respect what is written in our constitution. So if it's written membership, it means membership perspective. And I don't know how it's in the EU, because Ukraine is just moving to the EU membership. But I'm sure that treaties, principles, standards, it really means a lot. So if Ukraine meet Copenhagen criteria and all association treaty, it will be in the benefit. So please do not create some other desirable, not desirable. Membership is about membership. And actually, it's a key for us. And please also do respect, because I know that other countries who are now members of European Union, they also incorporated into their constitution the membership perspective. So nothing new we invented, but actually, I would like to say that Russian genocide against Ukraine, it's also one of the problems of the whole Western civilization, because the man-made famine organized by Stalin in last century wasn't properly condemned, and actually the communist regime wasn't really punished. So, and now we are facing the genocide. We are paying the highest price. And to talk today about that Ukraine is a donor of labor force. Ukraine is a great having resources like agriculture. But besides agriculture, God blessed Ukraine for other like critical raw materials, which are key for future industries. But we are here not to talk about resources. If EU is just about trade, or about how to contribute and make wealthier and prosper. So I'm not sure I want to be a part of such European Union. It's not about values, sorry. We are dying not just to be donor of European Union. We are dying just to be equal partner, to be member in family. Being in family, it doesn't mean that one son is good, second is better or others. So everyone should be considered as an equal partner. And we are ready to contribute, but actually to strengthen European security, to bring more prosperity and others. But I think the key is here to consider Ukraine as a spiritual basket, as a moral authority, which is actually helping to return Europe, not just to trade. We've already seen Nord Stream 2 and many other projects. And actually the genocide against Ukraine, it's also a part of double standards of the EU. Because for many 8 years, instead of preventing wars, there were not sanctions enough to stop Russia from organizing this genocide. So actually, I do believe that in 2, in 5, and 3, so I think we have to work on both directions, making you also attractive and also helping Ukraine to meet this criteria. And then this will be for the future generations, and actually being a geopolitical player. It doesn't mean just security, the modern weapon and other. It's also about values. And values for me personally first, then trade, economy and other things.
Thank you, Ms. Hopko. I wanted to say that join me in applauding our speakers, but you was much faster. So thank you so much for the food for thought we received from you today. And ladies and gentlemen, also many thanks for your attention and have a nice evening. Bye.
Recording stopped.